Let's see that map. In the days when the judges ruled in Israel, a severe famine came upon the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah left his home and went to live in the country of Moab, taking his wife and 2 sons with him. The man's name was Elimelech, and his wife's name was Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They entered the land of Moab, and they settled there. The story of the book of Ruth does not begin with Ruth. It begins with a famine in the land, a family looking for safety, looking for security in tough times, and went looking for it far from home. For this generation of the family of Israel, who had been born and raised in the promised land, for whom the promised land was the fulfilled given land, the promised land had become itself a wilderness. And they were probably not the only family who made that trip to Moab. Some scholars suggest that the story of the book of Ruth happened during the days of Gideon, who we can read about in Judges chapter 6, when the people were doing evil in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord had withdrawn his protection. And the Midianites and the Amalekites were swarming like locusts over Israel, and the text says that they were destroying the produce of the land, leaving Israel with no food, with no sheep, no oxen, no donkeys, and Israel was brought very low. And young parents of young children want to keep them safe. So probably more than just this one family went to Moab. Although Moab wasn't a great option, it might have been the best of a bunch of bad options. In the law of Moses that we read about in the first 5 books of the Bible, Moabites are named specifically as being people who are forbidden to go into the tabernacle, the place of worship of the family of Israel. And the reason why they were forbidden, the people of Moab were forbidden to go into the tabernacle, was because when the family of Israel had first escaped Egypt and escaped slavery, the Moabites had refused to help them, even though they were family of a sort. The nation of Israel descended from Abraham, and Moab descended from Abraham's nephew, Lot. They were family, but they were not friends. The Moabites worshipped other gods, gods of Baal and Chemosh, with sacrifices, both animal and human. And while Israel and Moab were not actively at war with each other, there was always tension between the two, but their languages were similar enough that you could fit your way into their culture. And most importantly, there was not a famine in Moab. So they looked for their best option, and this seemed to be it. But then their best option took a turn, and Elimelech, the father of the family, died, leaving Naomi and her 2 young sons. So she raised her sons to the point where they were old enough to find wives, and they found wives among the women of Moab, which they were really not supposed to do according to the law of Moses. And then the sons died, and we don't know what happened. The text hints that they were ill or in poor health, but it could have been anything in that time when the world was so rough. And now Naomi was in proper trouble. She was far from home. She had no land of her own. She had no career for earning a wage. She was isolated from her tribe, and she found herself as the head of a family that consisted entirely of women in the same position. It had been 10 years since they left Israel, and she heard that the famine had ended back home, and it was time to go back. It was time to return and hope for the best. So she and Ruth traveled all the way back to Bethlehem. traveling back across the river, back into the promised land. These two women together, one of them going home again and really not knowing what kind of reception she'd get, 10 years older with a grudge against God, and the other very, very young with so much to learn. Ruth chapter 2 begins with these words. Now there was a strong and brave man in Bethlehem named Boaz, who was a relative of Naomi's husband, Elimelech. And the rest of the book describes the story of how Ruth went to work to support Naomi, how Naomi provided guidance and advice for Ruth of how to find her way in this weird world that she found herself in, and how Boaz connected with them and did the work that was required to bring them home. And like I said, the story of Ruth does not begin with Ruth. It doesn't even end with Ruth. This story is not about Naomi's wisdom. It's not about Boaz's strength of character and generosity. It's not about Ruth's faithfulness. It is not a romance or a fable or a legend. So what is it? What is this story? And what does it have to say to us today? Well, there are two strong threads running through this event, running through the lives of these people that we're going to talk about this morning. The first thread is the thread of what if, and the second thread is the thread of what's next. So begin with what if. Let's take a look at this scripture here. This is the ending of the book of Judges. Judges comes immediately before Ruth. This is the time in which the story of Ruth happened. And this is the final words of the writer of the book of Judges. In those days, Israel had no king, and all the people did whatever seemed right in their own eyes. So what if, and follow me on this, what if for some of the people of Israel, what if what seemed right in their own eyes was actually doing what God had told them to do? What if what seemed right in their own eyes was actually the law that God had given them through Moses? What if some people read that and actually got it? What if some of the people dared to imagine that, as we talked about in Bible study on Wednesday, Israel actually did have a king, and that king was Yahweh God? When we read the book of Judges, we talked about this a bit last week, we've seen what happens when people ignore God's law. We've seen what happens, what people do to each other when they do what seems right in their own eyes, when they start defining their own ethical boundaries according to what is most expedient. But what if? What if there were people in those times who actually obeyed a law that demands provision for people who are all alone, that demands provision for people who are going hungry, that demands provision for people who are newcomers? Because that is what God's law demands. In the book of Leviticus, chapter 19, verse 9, when you harvest the crops of your land, do not harvest the grain along the edges of your fields. Do not pick up what the harvesters drop. And this principle also applies to grapes. It also applies to olives on the vine and on the tree. But God's law demands that you leave food in the field for the poor, for the foreigners living among you. And that command ends with, I am the Lord your God. In other words, I said so. What if people obeyed a law that actually commanded provision for widows who had no family? Deuteronomy chapter 25, this is a law. When brothers dwell together and one of them dies without a son, the widow must not marry outside the family. Her husband's brother is to take her as his wife, and the first son she bears will carry on the name of the dead brother, so that his name will not be blotted out from Israel. That may make us in our culture a bit uncomfortable, some of the details of how that plays out. But what is underlying it is God's concern for the vulnerable, that this woman who now has no son and now has no husband and therefore has no protection from a very, very harsh world is not left on her own. She is kept in the embrace of a family, and her husband's name carries on. And for a man to refuse to do that, for a man to refuse to take on that responsibility, was to expose himself to a profound shame in his community. He would, from then on, the text says, carry the label barefoot. And he is not to be trusted, and he is not to be respected. See, under the law of Moses, the line of inheritance of land and property went from first to sons, and then if there were no sons, to the daughters, and if there were no daughters, to brothers and to other cousins and other relatives. And I'm just gonna explain to you a little bit of the background of Naomi's situation, and I kind of sketched this out for my own understanding. So this is Naomi's situation as it stands under the law that God gave the people. Okay, so Elimelech owned land. Before he left for Moab, before he took his family to Moab, as we understand it, Elimelech would have sold his land to his neighbor Bob. And his neighbor Bob both understood the law, said that in a maximum of 49 years, when they encountered what was called the year of Jubilee, which you can look up, it's a really interesting concept, but in a maximum of 49 years, in the year of Jubilee, the land that Bob had bought would automatically return to Elimelech's family. Just automatically. And Elimelech's family would automatically return to their land. But any time before the year of Jubilee, Elimelech could negotiate to redeem the land, to buy it back. So for the 10 years that the family was living in Moab, neighbor Bob was farming Elimelech's land, keeping the profits as was fair. Then when Naomi returned, neighbor Bob still had the land and apparently was not interested in giving it back just yet. When Elimelech died, his sons inherited the land, but then his sons died, so their land now goes to the hands of the next in line, a cousin. And ultimately, when the year of Jubilee came around, the land would automatically return to cousin Fred, because cousin Fred was the next in line. The land would not go to Naomi. It would go to cousin Fred. And cousin Fred, under the law, should and could redeem the land, pay Bob the balance of what was left in the deal, and then fold Naomi into his family. But it was a package deal. It wasn't just the land. There was Ruth. And as it turned out, neighbor Bob didn't want to redeem the land back to Naomi, so she was stuck. Cousin Fred wanted the land, but that would mean marrying Ruth and making her one of his wives. And cousin Fred didn't want another wife because Ruth's kids, if they had kids together, would compete with his own existing kids. This is a really complicated. Yeah, I know, right? But the point of the matter is, basically, Naomi is stuck in the middle between these two inheriting parties, and she has nothing. She does not have a leg to stand on unless either Bob or Fred decides to do the right thing and bring her back to safety. And here comes Boaz. So Boaz challenges cousin Fred, and he says, look, are you going to do the right thing or not? And cousin Fred says, no, I don't want to. And cousin Fred basically, barefoots himself and says, no, here, I don't want to get involved in this. This is your thing. You deal with it. I'm good. I'm busy. So the role of kinsman redeemer, as we saw in the video, fell to Boaz, because he was the next in the family line. So he redeemed the land. He brought Naomi back into his family. He married Ruth and gave her safety, security, and a home. And that is how God's law is supposed to work. Deuteronomy chapter 15, verse 4, there's this beautiful, amazing promise that God gives to the people of Israel before they enter into the promised land. God says, there will be no poor among you. When you go into the promised land, nobody's going to be poor anymore. Nobody's going to go hungry. Because the Lord will bless you in the promised land and giving you all this inheritance if, and there's that word again, if you obey the Lord your God, if you are careful to follow these commandments that I am giving you today. The book of Judges and the book of Ruth stand side by side, one as a bad example, one as a good example, and they both ask the question, what if? What if people rejected God's law? What if people actually lived by God's law? What if? And then they both answer that question. This is what it would look like. And what do you know? It works. The other thread that runs through the text of the book of Ruth is the thread of what's next. And that's when I come to the title of my sermon, What's a Type? So let's see the next slide here. Typology. Typology is a wonderful Bible scholar word. It's like a seminary word. It's a wonderful word. This is what typology means, and it's important as we understand how to read the Old Testament and how to understand it in the light of the New Testament. The word typology is a method of interpreting some parts of Scripture by seeing a pattern which an earlier statement sets up and which later is explained, usually in one particular matter between a person, event, or thing in the Old Testament and a person, event, or thing in the New Testament. And we see comparisons that stress that one point of similarity. And those help us to see in the New Testament, person, event, or institution, the fulfillment of something that was hinted at in the Old Testament. The Old Testament is peppered with Easter eggs, like in a game or a DVD. It's peppered with hyperlinks, like you find on a web page that if you click on it, it opens a little box with more information or a picture, and you go, oh, I get that. And sometimes it's a similarity, and sometimes it's a contrast between something in the Old Testament and something in the New Testament. So, for example, if we read Romans chapter 5, we read about Adam. And the writer of the book of Romans, Paul, writes this. Now, Adam is and he uses the word, type of Christ, who is still to come. For the sin of this one man, Adam, caused death to rule over many. But even greater is God's wonderful grace and his gift of righteousness, for all who receive it will live in triumph in sin and death through this one man, Jesus Christ. Paul is creating a contrast here. He's pointing out a type in the text of the Bible between the first sin-filled man and the first sin-free man, between evil and good, between condemnation and acquittal, between the power of justice and the power of mercy, between the reign of death and the victory of life. And looking at Adam through the filter of Christ, it helps us to be reminded and to see that God has a plan. And this is it. So who else is a type of Christ? Any guesses? Moses is a type of Christ, absolutely, leading people to freedom out of slavery. Noah bringing us through the waters of death and into the new world. You know who else is a type of Christ? No. Boaz. Boaz is a type of Christ. Boaz, in this one point of comparison, that he was the kinsman redeemer, that he had the power to seek out someone who needed to be brought to safety, that he paid the price to bring them into his family. Boaz is a type of Christ, pointing us to that image of our Redeemer. There's another type that people find in the book of Ruth, and that type is Ruth herself. Many people point to Ruth as being a type not of Christ, but of his church. In the New Testament, after Jesus' death and resurrection, Paul, writing to the church in Galatia, writes to them, the scripture, and he's talking about the Old Testament, the scripture foresaw that God would justify the Gentiles, which is like anybody that's not a Jew. God would justify the Gentiles by faith. And the scripture foretold the gospel through Abraham. When God says to Abraham, all nations will be blessed through you, that is a hint of what God is going to do that we will call the gospel, the good news. And centuries later, I love this, centuries later, after the life of Abraham, this woman of Moab, this woman of Moab, the daughter of a nation named by God by name as not being allowed to go into the tabernacle, this woman of Moses is welcomed by God into his family, and she became an ancestor of Israel's greatest king, who you can bet was allowed to go into the tabernacle, and she became an ancestor of Christ himself. She belonged to the nations, like we do. She was a woman made righteous by faith in Yahweh God. Christ's church belongs to the nations, and we are a people made righteous, brought home, redeemed by faith. And we look forward to, shouting in eternity. In Scripture it says, every language, salvation comes from our God who sits on the throne. Salvation comes from the Lamb. Ruth's life is a type. She's not a fable, she's not a legend, but there is something in her life that makes her a type of all nations on earth saying yes to Yahweh God. Her hope is ours. Her faith is ours. And with her, we know what it means to say, as she said to Boaz, I am your servant. Spread your wings over your servant. You are my Redeemer. Jesus, our Redeemer. There is a famine in our land. There is unmet hunger. Hunger for compassion, for empathy, for kindness. Hunger for people and institutions that we can actually respect and trust. Hunger for information that we can actually rely on. Hunger for justice, for mercy, for love, for hope. Hunger for wisdom. In the book of Judges, the book of Judges confronts us with some of the worst of who humans can be. In the book of Ruth, we are confronted with some of the best of what humans can be. Faithful, loving, wise, generous, humble. And in these events, in the stories of the people who lived the story of Ruth, we can see what becomes possible when we, in whatever time, in whatever culture, when we live in faithfulness with God, when we live in faithfulness with each other, and when we follow God's law. Because the power of this story is not that Ruth was beautiful, or that Boaz was rich and handsome, or that Naomi was clever. The power of this story is that it was lived by people who were wise enough to live God's law. And obeying that law does not mean that God forces it down our throats, but he offers it to us. He offers us his wisdom, his peace, his hope. Because there is a famine in our land. People are lonely. People are skipping meals to pay the rent. People are being trafficked for profit. People are making up the rules as they go along and changing them as they see fit. People are doom scrolling and looking for hope. People are thinking that the universe is big and we are alone. There is a famine in our land. And if we obey the voice of the Spirit, if we obey the teachings of Jesus, if we look to find wisdom where it is offered to us for free by somebody who understands the world and understands us, if we live by his principles, is it possible that there need be no poor among us? There was a famine in the land, and God was at work in Naomi and in Boaz and in Ruth. And there is a famine in our land, and God is at work in us.